Welcome to my channel, The Orchid Hut. My name is Dana, and thank you for taking some of your time out of your day to watch one of my orchid videos. This one is going to be a repot of an Encyclia, but it does pose some challenges for how to repot it. So this one has been in my care for 4 or 5 months. It's still in the original pots that I purchased it in. I purchased it from Jewel Orchids last fall, and Jewel Orchids is based out of Georgia, and they do sell some great orchids. I think they're still having flat rate shipping of $10 for your entire orchid purchase, so that's a great way to save on shipping if you like to order orchids online. But this little Encyclia has been doing really well in my care for the months that I have had it, but it's now time to repot it because the last new growth is right up against the edge of the pot, and I can see new growth starting about right there, and then down inside the pot, which the camera may not be able to pick up on, is some new root growth. So this is the time to get this orchid into a place where that new pseudobulb can develop with a bit more room. Okay, so the reason though that this one is a challenge is because it is a primary hybrid. So let me show you the name, and then we'll talk a little bit about the parent orchids, the species orchids that were crossed to create this one. So it's called Encyclia David M. Johnston. And David M. Johnston was the founder of Jewel Orchids out of Georgia. And as best I can tell online, he has since passed, but he really enjoyed Encyclia orchids, and he liked making Encyclia hybrids. So these two species were crossed, and then they named the Encyclia primary hybrid after David M. Johnston. So let's talk a little bit about these two species Encyclias that were used to cross and create this primary hybrid, so that you can understand why I have a little bit of a repotting dilemma on my hands. Okay, so the first species parent is Mobusii. And Mobusii is primarily an orchid that is found in Cuba. And Encyclias in general can range from Florida to Mexico to Central America into South America, all the way down into Argentina, and then mostly I would say like in the western part of the Caribbean. So Mobusii can be found in the wild in Cuba. It is a lithophyte, which means unlike most other orchids which are epiphytes, the Mobusii Encyclia species enjoys growing its roots on rocks. Now that could be a little bit problematic when I go to repot this if this orchid that I have prefers to grow that way. But it is a intermediate to warm growing bright light orchid, so it would lead you to believe that you could grow it in your house given enough bright light, but you might be able to also grow it outside. Okay, so keep that species orchid in mind with all of its characteristics and how it grows in the wild. And now I'm going to tell you about the other parent orchid, which is Atrorubens. And Atrorubens is found at higher elevations in a very particular part of Mexico. And it's considered a cool-growing epiphytic Encyclia. So now you can see that the two parent orchids that created this one have pretty different growing conditions in the wild. So as I tried to research this orchid, I could not really find any information about what this one prefers. You know, genetically, it could have inherited the preferred growing environment of one parent, or possibly the other, or possibly a mix of the two, and maybe it's, you know, more tolerant in different temperature ranges. But I don't really know that because I've only had it in my house for the months that I've had it, wintering indoors. And the only other thing that I would say that I have noticed about caring for this orchid is that it is a bit more on the thirsty side, and if not watered frequently enough, the pseudobulbs do begin to noticeably shrivel, and then when it's watered, they plump back up. I also think that this orchid enjoys the sort of evaporative cooling effect of this little clay pot that surrounds the plastic pot. And when I purchased this orchid, there was live moss growing on the top of the pot, but that has since died for the most part, as best I can tell, probably because my indoor environment was not as humid as the greenhouse that it was grown in. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, first of all, unpot this one and see what's inside the plastic pot, see what's inside the clay pot. And then my direction right now is to put it in a plastic pot where I can see the root growth a little bit better, and of course a plastic pot that's slightly larger than the one that it's in now. And then I was thinking, well, I could, go ahead and then set one of these plastic pots inside another clay pot if I cleaned it up. And, it's not exactly a perfect fit. I don't know why here in the States they do not make plastic pots to fit inside clay pots. That one is maybe a bit better. And, this one may also be a little bit too deep. So I may end up taking a pair of scissors and cutting off a little bit of the top of this pot. And then when it sits down inside this clay pot, so much of that plastic won't be, sticking up quite so much. So all of these pots, the clay ones as well as this plastic one that has been used before, if I use it for this orchid, I do need to take a moment and wash those out really well. But the first part of this video is going to be to take this one out of the pot that it's in, and then I'll better be able to make some decisions about what kind of media and how to repot it. I do think that I will be keeping this one indoors for the heat of the summer here, because I'm not entirely certain that it's going to tolerate or appreciate the severe heat that we get in Southeast Texas in June, July, and August. So I may let it spend the spring outdoors and keep a close eye on it, and then bring it indoors for the very hot of the summer. Okay, so you're likely to watch me struggle removing this because I have a feeling that the roots have probably attached to the clay pot on the inside. And that is true. Okay. So this explains why this little orchid is so thirsty. Okay, so the situation here is a net pot, and it's going to have to be cut away. There's not going to be any alternative to save these roots if I just try to pull them out of that net pot. And then inside the net pot, there appears to be sphagnum moss. Okay, so let me go ahead and get my clippers and cut this net pot off, and then we'll be able to see a little bit more what's going on with this orchid. You can tell that the roots attach themselves or started to attach themselves inside the clay pot. So if I do this again, I may end up in the same situation. I also may go out to the garage and see if I can find another net pot that's slightly larger than this one. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video. I'm going to come back with my clippers so that I can cut this net pot away. I'm going to see if I have a slightly larger net pot, and if I don't, I'll have to go with one of the clear plastic pots that I showed you at the beginning of the video. Okay. So let me take a break, and I'll be right back to finish repotting this orchid. Okay, so it's always helpful to have a place of reserve orchid potting supplies so that you can rummage around and sometimes find exactly what you need. And that happened in this case, so I got really lucky. Okay, so this net pot is slightly larger than the net pot this orchid was in, so that's going to work out for me. Now let's see how this net pot fits in one of these clay pots. Ah, much better fit. Okay, so what I will be doing, even if I don't video this for you guys, is I'm going to really carefully clean and wash this clay pot in hot soap and water. And then once this orchid is repotted in this new net pot, I will just set it in here and it will have a very similar environment to how it was previously growing. Okay, so sometimes when you repot, you do have to think about not changing up stuff that's like not necessary to change. And if you can more closely match how the orchid is used to growing, at least for the first repotting, I do think you minimize the shock and allow the orchid to kind of pick up and do well much more quickly. Okay, so this net pot is pretty thin and flexible. It's not nearly as tough as some of the Tolumnia pots I have cut off in previous videos. So I'm going to clip away the plastic bit by bit, trying not to damage the roots, and get this off in such a way so that we can have a good look at the root system, work out all of that old sphagnum moss, and kind of make a decision about what to repot this in. It's a little bit delicate work here at the beginning, but now I have the top of the pot off. And now I need to just cut the bottom. And then see if I can work away the part in the middle, which might be a little bit more of a challenge. Whoop. Although these longer pieces of this plastic pot do just pull right out. Let's see. So I have not any kind of proven success with growing Encyclia type orchids. You know, some of them have been reclassified lately, and I have an Encyclia orchid that was reclassified to a Prosthecia, I believe is how you pronounce it. And I have had that one mounted for years and years. And while it has grown well and, you know, seems to be thriving, it has never bloomed for me. And if I'm remembering my orchid history correctly, I think even epidendrums at some point were considered encyclias, and then they got pulled out and reclassified, and I don't have any luck with epidendrums either. So if this one actually does well and blooms for me, it will be a first. I just don't have a good track record. It's not like they die on me. It's just that they don't bloom, which is, you know, indicative of them not exactly having the care and culture that they need to be completely successful. there's a big piece. So we shall see. And this one is a bit more of a guessing game, maybe than some others that you can read about and other people can tell you that they grow well, cared for a certain way. This one I think is relatively new. Maybe the jury is still out on the conditions that it will and won't accept in order to rebloom. Okay, well, let's see. What is happening here? Okay, so right there you can definitely see the new root growth coming right underneath that last pseudobulb. So that is the root system that we want to be successful with after this orchid is repotted. And the sphagnum moss is, you know, not in too bad a shape here. But I'm going to pull out as much as I can. I may leave that little bit of moss on top, mostly because it may, in more humid conditions, turn green again and grow. Okay. And this is a case of, you know, getting out the majority of the sphagnum moss, but maybe not all. All right, let's check these roots. Okay, unfortunately, most of these roots are dried and without substance. So, what we are going to do is to just give it a good general root trim. Now, as is always the case with these orchids, the oldest roots are on the side with the oldest pseudobulbs. So the plant was very, very young here when it had these tiny little pseudobulbs, so the roots on this side of the plant are the most, or have been dead probably the longest. So we're going to go ahead and cut that away. And this is one of those root systems where it's kind of like in between having too many roots to individually pick through, but it's not as bad as some. So let me take a little bit of extra time here to just analyze the individual roots. And if you feel each one, you know, if it's papery, if it doesn't have any kind of substance to it, you can immediately tell that it's no longer living. And sometimes roots like this, you can feel closer to the plant and there's a little bit of substance, but as you move your way down towards the tip of the root, it has died. So in that case, it is okay to cut a partial root. So cut off the part at the bottom that's dead, but you can leave a little bit of it closer to the plant, and oftentimes an orchid will branch from there in order to produce new root growth. So it's not an all or nothing thing. You can choose to cut just a part of a root. And it makes me wonder as I do this, you know, did this much of the root system die while I was caring for it, simply because of the drastic change in growing conditions, because I'm fairly certain that this one might have come from a very humid greenhouse type environment. And inside my house during the winter, there was not that kind of humidity. And right here, wow, this is so small, I don't know if the camera will be able to pick up on it. But if I can get it to focus, right here, where my finger is, there's a little tiny green branch of a root. Hope the camera focused on that. Okay. All right. So let me take another pause. I am going to quickly wash this, clean up the mess, and then come back for the repotting. Okay, so back from the sink, I have rinsed the root system of this orchid. I am choosing not to pick too much at the last little bit of sphagnum that's at the core of the plant, because I really just don't want to disturb that. And after all, I am putting it back in a lot of sphagnum moss, since that's how it was originally potted. And I've also decided that I don't really need to spray the root system here. These roots look fine, and the new little roots that are growing look just fine, so I'm choosing not to spray with hydrogen peroxide. And I've put some fresh sphagnum moss in the bottom of this net pot, and I've decided to use, especially since I have it, some potting mix that I have on hand for repotting keikis with smaller root systems. And this is for miniatures and seedlings, and so I definitely would consider this orchid a miniature. So I'm going to put a little bit of that very, very fine bark mix on top of the sphagnum that's in the bottom of that pot. And of course, these bark pieces are so fine that if I put too many, they're just going to fall straight out the side of the pot. So I'm going to kind of layer it. I'm going to put a little bit of sphagnum, a little bit of the miniature bark mix, and then another layer of sphagnum. Let's kind of check for height here. Okay, that's looking pretty good actually. That might even be a little bit too much, because the new growth definitely needs to be able to be close to the new media. And I want to pot this so that the older growth is close to the edge of the pot, because I want the new growth on this side to have room for at least a couple of years. Okay. And some of the bark is, coming out the larger holes of the net pot, but that's fine. And because the root system is not really able to anchor the plant at this time, I may also need to be finding a small stake to stabilize it in the pot. So I'm just tucking the sphagnum in, and it keeps wanting to kind of shift towards the place that I don't want it to go. And you're really not going to be able to tap sphagnum moss into place like you can with bark, so you do have to push with your finger just a bit. It's kind of having a mind of its own how it wants to go into this pot. Okay, now in my environment, sphagnum moss on the top of the pot is not necessarily the best option because it will grow a lot of algae. So I'm going to try to just add a thin layer of bark on the top so that that sphagnum is not directly exposed. Okay, so yeah, the new root growth is right underneath this pseudobulb, and so it's touching the sphagnum moss, and then it has the extra bark on top to help hold the plant in place. We'll press down just a little bit. And I'm going to water this one in really well and just kind of watch and see if I need to stake it over the next few days. And once I clean out this clay pot, I'll just set it down in there, and it will be a very, very similar growing environment to what it was used to before. And wish me luck, cross your fingers. Maybe I'll have a bloom finally from an Encyclia someday. And you know, if you learned something new or just enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. That's always appreciated. The subscribe button will be coming up in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. The little notifications bell will let you know when I've posted something new. So thank you so much for watching, and talk to you next time.